Well, welcome everybody to day 3 of the Elakha Alliance Sea Otter Science and Kelp Symposium. We appreciate you being here and taking the time. I'm very excited today to have a couple of great speakers on some very interesting topics. So again, I'm going to share my screen and run through a little bit of introduction, and then we'll get right into the talk. So again, thanks so much for attending. We appreciate it. Our whole goal here is to share the good science that's helping to inform our project and take us down some of these scientific bunny trails that in our daily life we don't often get to, but it's great to hear from the researchers that are working on these things. And again, for those of you who donated online when you registered, we really appreciate it. Those funds have added up and helped us to provide the technology for today. Consider an additional donation if you go back to our website and click on the donate. And just a forewarning, your name and email will be added to our list to receive our monthly newsletter, The Raft. If you don't want to get it, you may certainly unsubscribe. We'll be happy to do that. We won't be offended. We want to thank our co-sponsors today, the Hatfield Marine Science Center and the Oregon chapter of the Wildlife Society, for helping us get the word out and helping to advise the structure of the program. Also, thanks to the Meyer Memorial Trust for the financial support for the Elakha Alliance. We wouldn't be here today without them. So about the Elakha Alliance, we are an Oregon nonprofit seeking to improve the diversity, resilience, and productivity of nearshore and estuarine ecosystems by restoring sea otters to Oregon. We are committed to sound science as the basis for this restoration work, and we are committed to understanding and avoiding or minimizing impacts on other ocean users. We realize this is not 1856 anymore, it's 2020, and we are committed to learning lessons from the lessons offered elsewhere about the effects of sea otters on the ecosystem and coastal communities. So check us out at www.elakhalliance.org. And just a heads up, we're going to be sending you for participants here, a short link to a short survey to give us a little bit of feedback on the symposium, how we can do it better and what you might have learned, and etc. So we would appreciate your attention to that when it comes. So please mute yourself. I think most of you or all of you are. If you have questions, send them to John Goodell in the chat room or use the Q&A function at the bottom, and he will be asking questions at the end. So we will go until the 55-minute mark, and then we will take a 5-minute break before our final presentation. So it's a little bit of background here. A couple months ago, the Guardian newspaper published an extensive article on recently published research from Elkhorn Slough in California that showed that sea otters have an unexpected and positive benefit on estuarine ecosystems. Other media took note of the article, and the research gained wide attention. So we were intrigued because it is highly likely that sea otters once inhabited estuaries in Oregon, and we felt that this research might help us understand how estuaries should be factored into decisions about restoring sea otters to Oregon. As many of you know, eelgrass in estuaries provides critical habitat for many marine species, and yet is under constant threat from the impacts of human activities. So in addition to thinking about how sea otters affect kelp forests in the ocean, we need to think about how sea otters affect eelgrass in estuaries. For that reason, we're thrilled to have the lead author of that paper, Dr. Brent Hughes, join us today. He is an assistant professor in coastal ecology and conservation at Sonoma State University in California. I would say that in this photo, Dr. Hughes looks happy as a clam. He once spent a summer in Charleston, Oregon at the Oregon Institute for Marine Biology, and I like to think that influenced his research interests today, which center around foundation habitats such as seagrass, salt marsh, and kelp that provide valuable ecosystem services and yet are threatened by human activities. He is also interested in how research can inform management and restoration of the processes that drive ecosystem resilience. And since that's what we're all about, we're very happy to have Brent making time to join us today and to help us understand the relationship between sea otters and estuaries. So Brent, you may now share screen, and thank you.
Okay, hey, thanks Bob and John and the Elakha Alliance and all the sponsors and the speakers. Okay. Well, apologies to Bob for if it's on my end. But yeah, thank you everybody again. Thanks Bob and John for the third time, and everybody in attendance, listening to my talk, to Tim's talk, and hopefully sticking around for a Q&A. And as Bob mentioned, I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Kansas. When I grew up, I spent, very little time at the ocean, but I was always kind of thrilled with it. I romanticized about it. And after I graduated college, I had this great opportunity just to go take some classes at the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology during the summer. And it was a life-changing experience for a boy from Kansas. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the Rocky Intertidal. I fell in love with Coos Bay. I fell in love with the whole coastline. And it was because of my experience in Oregon, is probably why I'm speaking to you now. So thank you for that. And, today I'm going to, talk more about the estuarine side of sea otter ecology. But I did want to kind of point out that although Bob mentioned that we are looking towards the future, this story really happened 200 years ago or so. And if the events that didn't unfold 200 years ago didn't happen, I probably wouldn't be talking to you about sea otters right now. And I think some of these pictures, these kind of older photos of sea otters, hunters, kind of really put a good description of this. I actually put a photo of Steller's sea cow at the upper right, because Steller's sea cow is kind of the poster species for marine extinctions, at least on our coast, and for marine mammals. And I'd just like to remind everybody, the sea otter was going in that direction until intervention and conservation led to their almost, leading to their eventual recovery, we hope. So now you've probably all heard the story by this time of sea otters as the heroes of the kelp forest. This is one of our most cherished examples in ecology and marine ecology. We are pretty well aware that sea otters can play this really important structuring role in kelp forests by removing urchins. And by removing urchins, that frees up the kelp from really intense herbivory. And so it's all due in many parts of our coast due to the sea otter. But you probably are not aware that the sea otters are also heroes of the salt marsh. And you might be, scratching your head if you've never heard of a sea otter in a salt marsh. Well, this is all about kind of a lot of the research that we've been doing in the last decades, following sea otters on their kind of trajectory towards recovery in Central California. And a lot of this research stems from some research I've been doing with colleagues around the world about challenging old paradigms about what we think of large consumers and predators and species that are under threat from either overhunting or loss of habitat. What we're discovering in certain situations with conservation that allows for recovery, it's kind of unraveling and challenging our old paradigms of what we think, the habitat breadth, the amount of space that an animal can use. And so, here are just some examples. I'll just point out a few from a paper I wrote with some colleagues a couple of years ago. We often think of gray wolves, for example, as being primarily terrestrial predators, but it turns out that gray wolves can actually hunt in the Rocky Intertidal. They're great swimmers, and they can actually utilize marine habitats very well. And another prime example is a mountain lion. Well, in certain situations where mountain lions are somewhat protected or their habitats are protected, we're seeing them using non-mountain ecosystems like grasslands. We're seeing orangutans be able to use deforested lands. On the bottom right-hand corner is a river otter, a close cousin of the sea otter. And we generally think of the river otter as a freshwater animal, hence the name river otter. But as we are following the recovery of river otters, we're noticing that they can use marine habitats, just like this one using a rocky intertidal beach. We see them using the estuaries, and they can do quite well foraging and feeding in estuaries, almost like they can behave as sea otters. And so when taken together, we can see that conservation has led to us kind of rethinking what the true breadth of habitats these animals can use. And this is the idea of a skewed baseline. And so, if you're of my generation or even a younger generation, and you have no idea of what the world should be like or what it looked like in the past, you might go out to a kelp forest and you see a sea otter or a raft of sea otters, and you might think, this is probably where they belong. I've read about them. I know there are these kelp forest animals, and so this is where they should be. And this is the idea, this ability to use a range of habitats is what we call a niche in ecology. And so what we're seeing with kind of the challenging of these old paradigms is that the historic niche breadth of a lot of these animals, including the sea otters, is much more expansive than we once knew. And this is just a product of history. Really, ecology, the science that we know, modern day ecology, really started in the 20th century. So our interpretation of what ecology is and what conservation should look like and how animal populations should be structured and the habitats they use really comes from ecology being a really young discipline. And so a lot of the earlier studies were looking at a lot of these populations, including sea otters, from a perspective of them in the early stages of recovery. And sea otters in California are a classic example of this. So as we know, sea otters nearly hunted to extinction. In California, it was thought actually for years in the earliest 20th century that they might be extinct. And then a raft of sea otters, in this Life magazine example, they called it a herd. This herd of sea otters was spotted off the Big Sur coastline. And you might think, well, why was it spotted off the Big Sur coastline? Well, if you look at the Big Sur coastline, or if you've been there, it can be quite treacherous, right? And oftentimes the roads are closed. It's difficult to get there by boat because it's so wave exposed. So if you go back 100 years and think about, somebody who might be interested in finding a sea otter or hunting a sea otter, and it would be really challenging to get to that stretch of coastline. And so for that reason, we found it was no surprise that the last remaining patch of sea otters was found on this very rugged coastline away from human predators. And so, but because of that, we had kind of this understanding that sea otters were really these kelp forest animals, right? And so, slowly over time, sea otters have expanded from that Big Sur location and now have expanded both north and to south. And so their southern limit is around Point Conception near Santa Barbara. And their northern limit is just south of San Francisco, about 20 or 30 kilometers. And within that stretch of coastline, there really is only two significant estuaries, Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay, and they're on that map. The black dots, Drake's Estero and San Francisco Bay, keep those in mind. We're going to come back to those later. But so as they've been expanding, we're seeing that they can use different habitats. They can feed on different prey resources. It's not just urchins, it's also crabs and mussels and abalone. And now they're using these estuaries, these two major estuaries in California. And so now all of a sudden the niche breadth, our understanding of the sea otter is really, really growing. And so there are these, ghosts that we are calling ghosts of conservation past that are kind of, as we track the sea otters and following them through time and their expansion, these ghosts are kind of telling us, hey, we were using these habitats previously. And so what we were seeing when sea otters started using estuaries in California, it kind of seemed like a little bit of a surprise, or maybe they don't really belong there, but who knows. But as we have been following them and their behaviors and their movements and their ecology in these estuaries, we're seeing they're revealing themselves almost in real time. And it's quite exciting to be a scientist tracking a recovering population and learning from it. So this is kind of the foundation of a lot of the research that I'm doing, along with Dr. Tinker, who's been a big collaborator of mine, who will be speaking next about primarily the outer coast. So today's talk really does focus on these estuaries as prime habitats for sea otters. And so my first step into the sea otter world was really not from a sea otter's perspective at all. I'm more of a marine botanist, actually. I study kelps and seagrasses and salt marshes, and that's what I'm really kind of curious about. And my PhD research was really more interested in the effects of eutrophication or algal blooms on seagrass beds. Seagrasses they're kind of like mini kelp forests, is kind of how I describe them. They're really important habitats for fish, crab, many other different species of invertebrates, also some marine mammals like harbor seals. They filter out contaminants. They sequester carbon, which is really important for when we think about climate change. And so they could be these kind of climate change carbon sinks. And they dampen wave energy, so they can actually protect shorelines. So these are seagrasses are habitats that are highly threatened, but habitats that are essential for humans, for fish, and we want to protect them. And in fact, our federal government through NOAA has a no net loss policy on seagrass. So that means most seagrass you can't harvest, you can't really even disturb it. That's how valued of a habitat is. But what we know about seagrasses is they're extremely sensitive to nutrients and algal blooms. So on seagrasses, the algal blooms that affect them most often are just really tiny algae that grows on the seagrass. But the algae, it's not like big or anything. It's kind of microscopic actually, but it just grows enough to kind of create a fuzz that can cover the seagrass, and it can eventually shade it and cause seagrass dieback. And so that was my main interest. And when I started studying seagrasses in estuaries in California, it's primarily Elkhorn Slough. Elkhorn Slough is one of the highest nutrient-loaded estuaries that we've monitored on the planet. And it's primarily due to agricultural inputs coming from the Salinas Valley. It's also a site of a major upwelling zone. And when we think about Oregon estuaries, these are very similar estuaries to California estuaries, and they're very upwelling driven, right? So there's these big nutrient pulses that come in. But in Elkhorn Slough, it's kind of like upwelling's happening all the time, year round, because of the agricultural runoff. And because of it, the estuary is basically always one big algal bloom. But remarkably, the seagrasses, when I started studying them in around 2010, they were doing really, really well. There were no epiphytes growing on them. They were some of the biggest and healthiest seagrass beds that we've monitored in California. And they're also characterized by this invertebrate assemblage, these really tiny animals. Well, some of them are not so tiny. Some of them are actually the size of your pinky finger or your thumb, which is still might be considered tiny. But what you can see here in this diagram, these little things that look like slugs or cockroaches, those are these invertebrates that play this really essential role. And so what they do, especially these sea slugs, we call them sea hares, is they act like little lawnmowers in the seagrass, and they keep they actually eat the algae growing on the seagrass without eating the seagrass itself. So they play this really important function. And so what we also noticed in Elkhorn Slough was that these sea slugs, these isopods, were in such great abundance, and they were so big, it was almost like they didn't have any predators. And so this really kind of launched a whole line of questions and really kind of banging our heads against the wall, trying to figure out how the seagrass was which was once actually driven almost near local extinction, how it's been able to rebound and recover in this kind of degraded state of the estuary. And so we looked at physical factors and oceanographic factors, and nothing really seemed to work. And for me, as a marine botanist, the sea otters swimming in my study beds, I kind of just ignored them. But they were everywhere. And so at one point, it was just becoming a little too difficult to keep on ignoring them. So that's when I started collaborating with Tim, and we started looking at the dynamics between sea otters and seagrass, and the recovery of sea otters in the Elkhorn Slough estuary correlated almost perfectly with the recovery of seagrass in the system. And so that triggered a whole new set of questions and hypotheses and experiments. And after a while, all signs pointed to the sea otter playing this really essential role. And the way it happens, what we discovered is that if you have a system with no sea otters, especially, and this is really important for estuaries, you can get a flourishing crab population because sea otters love to eat crab. And sea otters eat so much crab, and because of their high metabolic demands, they can easily eat 8,000 crabs a year. And that is a ton of crab removal by just one individual. And so it's one of the first things they go at in these estuaries. They're easy prey, they have high caloric intake, but without the sea otter, the crabs can go left unchecked. And then they can become the predator in the seagrass system. And that's what we've seen in Central California. These estuaries without crab or without sea otters, you have an overabundance of crab. They munch down on these grazers, and then you can get unhealthy seagrass. But what happened in Elkhorn Slough was the sea otters recovered, pretty much took out the crabs. The crabs are still there. They're just a lot smaller and way less abundant. This freed these really important grazers to do their functional role. And now we have a recovering seagrass. It's gone from near extinction to almost its historical extent prior to all the agricultural activity and human disturbance of the estuary. So it's been quite a remarkable recovery for that seagrass. So, Elkhorn Slough it's a tiny estuary, right? It's smaller than South Slough. And it's 10 kilometers long. So it was a really interesting case study. So we've teamed up with folks from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, Ginny Eckert's lab, and what you'll see here, Dr. Wendell Raymond, who just finished his PhD, looking at these same relationships up in Southeast Alaska, primarily Prince of Wales Island. But what we know about these seagrasses is in Alaska is that they take up a tremendous amount of habitat. About 16,000 kilometers of shoreline are covered with seagrass. So if you think about Elkhorn Slough, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we see in Southeast Alaska. And since recently, sea otters have been recovering also in Southeast Alaska, and actually the recovery's gone quite rapidly compared to other parts of the coast. And we've seen the same phenomenon where they'll use the outer coast, but then they've been moving into these more estuarine type systems, these shallow water, soft bottom systems. And so we wanted to test out, well, does this trophic cascade apply to Southeast Alaska? Can we take that model from Elkhorn Slough and apply it here? And so what you see is in the bottom left-hand corner is Wendell Raymond. That's often how I've seen him, with his head in the water counting seagrass. But what he's found is that there is a relationship, this positive relationship between sea otters. In this top left graph here, this is a sea otter index. So it takes, this is what Wendell has done, is he's taken data from sea otters, which include, them digging pits, to just observational counts of sea otters, and various other metrics that kind of give us an idea of how heavily some of these sites, seagrass sites, are being used by otters. So the higher the sea otter index, the more sea otters you have. And that really correlated really nicely with all these different sites that we went to, about 25 different sites, looking at seagrass biomass. And so right here you see the above ground biomass. These are what you see in my background, the shoots. This is the eelgrass, the Zostera marina, which is the same seagrass that we find in Elkhorn Slough and everywhere on our coast, all the way up to the Aleutians. And so the above ground biomass is just everything but the roots. And so we see this really nice correlation with sea otter index and the health and biomass of the seagrass. So this is kind of preliminary data. Or the paper, Wendell's paper is now in review at Oikos. But what's interesting is the trophic mechanisms are not the same. And we're working on what the potential trophic mechanisms between sea otters and seagrass might be, because they appear to be a little bit different than Elkhorn Slough. And so we're learning a lot about that. And what we're learning is that these Alaskan systems are also way less eutrophic compared to Elkhorn Slough, or even a lot of the Oregon estuaries, which we know can be eutrophic, and oftentimes due to upwelling. So as we're following, if we're going to go back to Elkhorn Slough, and this is kind of where a lot of the more discovery is happening, is that as we're following these otters in the seagrass, we started noticing some things that no scientist has ever seen before. And it was happening right in front of our eyes. So it's kind of cool. And so this is predator reoccupation of a novel habitat. And this novel habitat are salt marshes. And what you see here is a nice pickleweed salt marsh in Elkhorn Slough. In these salt marshes, this is kind of adding to the whole complexity of, what sea otters can do on an ecosystem level. Is Elkhorn Slough is actually, it's eroding away. The sediment inputs to the system are just not enough for these marshes to produce and to keep up with sea level rise. On top of it, we have these burrowing crabs, which are a different species of crab. They're called Pachygrapsis. They're the striped shore crab. You have them up in Oregon. And they're very common in the rocky intertidal, but they're also very common in these salt marshes, where they burrow and cause disturbance to the salt marshes, which is, we think, leading to a lot of the erosion in the system. So what we found as we were following the sea otters of the seagrass is that they started coming up to the marshes and feeding on these crabs that are burrowing. And so we're looking at what are the potential effects of that removal. So what I'm going to show you right now is a video that was taken from a GoPro video of a sea otter. This is probably one of our earliest observations of sea otters using a salt marsh. Not many people in the world have actually seen a sea otter using a salt marsh. So here we go. So in it, you can see the sea otter's coming up. It's munching on these crabs. It can eat several of these crabs after a single dive. So it can actually grab like 5 or 10 of them. It's checking out our GoPro through its periscoping behavior and goes back down for a little shallow water crab snack. So there's a lot of benefits to these salt marshes for the sea otter themselves. So we believe that the sea otters are having these positive effects by removing these crabs that are disturbing the salt marsh. But the salt marsh too, also in some ways, the seagrasses are great habitats. You can think about it, an animal that needs to maintain its metabolism and its thermal core temperature throughout its entire life. If it has an opportunity to haul out on a salt marsh when it's kind of a warm day, that could be energetically benefit to the otter. Also, these tidal creeks, the seagrasses, they're very shallow. They're usually less than 5 feet, no more than 10 feet for the seagrass beds. The salt marshes are high intertidal. So, and these tidal creeks that you see here, they're no more than 5 or 6 feet deep. So can you imagine now, all of a sudden you're not in a kelp forest, you don't have predators, you don't have to dive super deep. You have an abundance of food, and you have a great place to rest and also to have your pups rest. So it's kind of a win-win situation that we have going on here in Elkhorn Slough. And so with this, we've discovered that, these sea otters are really kind of reinvading these salt marshes at really high numbers. And when you take it together with the seagrass beds in Central California, the Elkhorn Slough estuary has the highest concentration of sea otters in the entire state, which kind of gives evidence to the support that estuaries are can be really important ecosystems for the sea otter. But likewise, the sea otter can have really important impacts to the ecosystem itself. And so we're also, as we're following these sea otters along, we're making more discoveries. And so this is, really a question of, can restored food webs provide invasion resistance? And so some of you might be aware of the European green crab. It invaded our coast in, I believe, the 80s. And and it's taken over some estuaries and coastlines. It's expanded all the way up to British Columbia. It's probably one of the nastier invaders that we have in California, just because it's a predator and can have big impacts on native communities. And typically when we see these green crab in high abundances, they're usually in the upper parts of estuaries. That's just because they can't compete necessarily with larger cancer crabs. But, and this is a typical case that we see in Elkhorn Sloughs, that these green crabs have these strongholds in the upper parts of the estuary. And what's also really interesting about the Elkhorn Slough estuary is that the estuary is divided almost in half by the Union Pacific Railroad. The green crab, through culverts and tide gates, can get to both sides of the estuary, both sides of the railroad tracks. The sea otter can only really get to one side of the track. So we've been using this to our advantage to ask the question, well, can sea otters provide invasion resistance? And the photo you see on the right is a photo from one of our volunteers, but this discovery of sea otters eating green crab came from us following them in the salt marshes. So we were all the way up in the estuary, far from the mouth of the ocean, even far from the seagrass beds. We're basically at this point in brackish water marshes. And what we were loading our boat back on the trailer. We were on the dock and we saw this sea otter eating just green crab after green crab. It must have eaten about 30 green crab in a half hour. It was amazing. And so this really popped this new question. And so what we've been doing to kind of address this as a kind of a first pass is looking at areas on either side of the railroad tracks where either sea otters can get to the green crab or they can't get to the green crab. And the Elkhorn Slough National Estuary and Research Reserve, the sister reserve to South Slough, has been doing some great crab monitoring, especially with the green crab, for over a decade. And so what we saw through crab trapping and monitoring is that these areas that were formerly strongholds for the European grey crab, as soon as the sea otters got there, we almost don't catch a green crab anymore. On the other side of the railroad tracks, green crab are doing just great. So it really kind of indicates that sea otters could be providing invasion resistance. And this is all through food web restoration. So what does this all amount to? Well, it's kind of a novel rediscovered coastal food web, which is kind of a mouthful. It's novel because we have these new species in it. A lot of these estuaries are heavily invaded. In this particular case, it's the green crab, but it's also a rediscovered food web, right? So if you're adding sea otters into it, sea otters, what we know about the history of sea otters is, and this goes all the way back through the Native American indigenous communities and their midden grounds, is that we often find sea otters throughout these middens, which means we find them throughout the course of history, mixed in with all these estuarine species, far away from a kelp forest where, indigenous populations probably weren't transporting sea otters, 80 miles to get to, the East Bay of San Francisco. So we know that, this was likely and plausibly, highly plausibly, a rediscovered food web. So rediscovered meaning we weren't the first to know about this. The indigenous communities were the first to know about this. So it really is kind of exciting to rediscover this food web. So a lot of this talk has been all about, well, what are sea otters doing? You know, what are they doing to the ecosystem as we follow them in estuaries? But we can flip that on its head and say, well, what can estuaries do for sea otters? And some of this paper comes from work by Tim Tinker and Brian Silliman and several others, where we were looking at, well, these areas where predation is a big deal for the sea otter, you know, what's going on in the estuaries nearby. And so some of you might be aware that in places like Alaska, killer whales can be major predators of the sea otter. And in fact, it appears that recently the killer whales have been driving the sea otter populations way down, almost to the point of collapse. But there are some lagoons in the Aleutian Islands, specifically around Adak Island. There's Clam Lagoon, which has one of the biggest seagrass beds on the planet. And what we see is that, well, these estuaries, when predation gets really intense, these can provide predation refugia for the sea otter. So in the top left graph, that's Adak Island. The blue line is the outer coast where killer whales are hunting. The red line is Clam Lagoon, presumably where killer whales can't even get in because it's so shallow. And what we see is as otters are rapidly declining in the outer coast, the Clam Lagoon population is kind of holding steady. In California, it's kind of a similar situation, but different predator. And Tim will probably talk about this a little bit, so I won't steal his thunder, but they are a big deal in terms of predation. And so what we are seeing in California is basically on either end, the north and south end of the sea otter range, there are significant great white shark populations, and especially nursery grounds for white sharks. And these baby sharks, or not baby sharks, juvenile sharks, will cause mortality to the sea otter, probably because they're learning how to hunt. And so they'll see a sea otter and they might bite it, mistaking it for prey. They oftentimes won't kill it, but it will wash up to shore with a mortal wound on it, and it's easy to identify it being a great white. So that's what Tim has discovered. And so I won't go too far into that, but it's really limited the expansion of sea otters to the point where the population's kind of plateaued. But in Elkhorn Slough, what we see is a very different trend and trajectory. In fact, what we know is about Elkhorn Slough, we think it's actually reached carrying capacity. And again, the highest concentration of the sea otters in California. So that kind of leads us to, well, what's next in California? And a lot of this does come back to history. And some people for a while have been envisioning sea otters in San Francisco Bay, but asking an important question, well, what were sea otters once in San Francisco Bay? And I encourage everybody who's interested in the subject to pick up this book by Adele Ogden. It was written in 1937. Adele wrote this great book called The Sea Otter Trade from 1784 to 1848. It's so rich with information and historical facts, and it's just chock full of everything a sea otter enthusiast would enjoy reading, and it gives great historical context. And I think that we need that to some degree. But Ogden, in her book, wrote extensively about the San Francisco Bay and about a lot of the Russian and Spanish fur traders that were using San Francisco Bay as hunting grounds for the sea otter. And here's a passage from Adele Ogden's book. In the bay from San Francisco to the estuary of Santa Clara, the ground appeared covered with black sheets due to the great quantity of otters which were there. And so, we estimate that this population before hunting was definitely in the thousands, or there's probably a high certainty it was in the thousands. Currently, sea otters are still not in San Francisco Bay. So this gives really kind of great evidence that they once were, especially when you combine it with the Native American middens around the Bay Area that are, again, loaded with sea otter bones. So this estuary was once sea otter heaven until the fur hunters came in. They actually enslaved Aleut hunters from Alaska because they were such expert hunters to come down and hunt for them in San Francisco Bay. I believe the number of otters being removed was, in the hundreds per day. So in a quick amount of time, they wiped out that otter population. And I would imagine that, that population was, for sea otters in estuaries, they're probably a little bit easier to hunt than maybe the Rocky or Rocky Coast, outer coast, just because it is a benign environment, somewhat more benign environment, not entirely benign, but in that the fact that sea otters were just kind of everywhere in San Francisco Bay. So we're looking at San Francisco, let's fast forward to now. We're looking at San Francisco Bay as, a potential recovery site for Elkhorn or for sea otters. And, it's not, we're not making management decisions right now, that we're kind of providing the managers to make these decisions, whether they recover there naturally or whether it's a human influence recovery. We want to be able to inform management what that might look like. So we can take the population model, growth model from Elkhorn Slough. Actually, we can just take the population growth rate in Elkhorn Slough, model that, and apply it to San Francisco Bay, because we know from Elkhorn Slough now that we have, over a decade of data on the habitat use of these sea otters. These habitats are very similar to what we see in San Francisco Bay. A lot of them are going to be similar to what you see in your Oregon estuaries. We're talking about seagrass beds, mud flats, salt marshes, and even kind of those more deeper water channels too. The open water can also be habitat, especially when we think about rafting and stuff. So we can take all these habitats, map them in San Francisco Bay, apply a population model that looks at habitat-specific growth rates in these different habitats, and start making predictions about how many sea otters might be available or might be able to be supported by San Francisco Bay. So here's one of the model outputs that Tim produced, and we play with we can play with different scenarios. I believe in this scenario, it's like, okay, let's put 20 animals, sea otters, starting in San Francisco Bay, maybe 10 males, 10 females. Let the model run for about 50 years, and then see what happens. And so, our predictions here are that San Francisco Bay could easily support 6,000 otters, if not more. This is kind of a game changer when we think about sea otter conservation in California, because right now the population's at about 3,000, still on the endangered species list. Putting San Francisco into this context could actually triple the population, which would be huge for obviously the sea otters, but we have to think, well, what does that mean for San Francisco and the communities in San Francisco? Who would be impacted? Who would benefit? Tourism would be a big benefit. There's going to be people who just want to see sea otters. And then could be these ecosystem benefits as well. So what you're seeing here, just to point out what this map is, just not confuse you, is basically taking that habitat-specific population growth model and mapping it out over the entire San Francisco Bay estuary. And these areas in red are these areas that are kind of hotspots, that would likely be hotspots. These are primarily seagrass beds. So we see it in Richardson Bay. This whole San Pablo Bay, North Bay complex is really rich in habitat. However, San Francisco Bay also comes with risks, and this might differ substantially from Oregon estuaries, just given that this is San Francisco Bay. It's huge, it's massive, it's got a lot of uses to it, and it can be kind of a mess. And for sea otters, if we think about sea otters in San Francisco Bay, it's going to be a lot different than what it was 200 years ago. The bay has fundamentally changed. And there's all these risks, and we have contamination via mercury and other kind of harmful pollutants. We have potentially differences in prey. We have boat traffic, which is a huge deal when we consider shipping lanes and ferry traffic and recreational boat traffic. Then there's also the risk of oil spills. There are oil refineries right here in the bay, and in fact, right where we see some of the prime habitats, there are oil refineries right on the coast. So, and this comes from a paper by Jane Rudebush, who was from a student at San Francisco State. This paper is actually now almost published. It's in press right now in a journal called Pure J. So really, this is going to be really informative for managers who are considering reintroduction, or what a sea otter population will look like in San Francisco Bay. Where would it go? And what are the risks? And some of them are overlapping. And because there's such high risks, we're also looking at estuaries outside of San Francisco Bay, such as estuaries around Point Reyes. Point Reyes is vastly different from San Francisco Bay, but it's also very close to it. So it's almost like Point Reyes could be a really important area for sea otter recovery, without having some of the risks that would go along with San Francisco Bay. And if sea otters decided to go San Francisco Bay, they'd be only 20 kilometers away or so. So we're looking at estuaries in Point Reyes. It's this little section off to the left. It's actually it kind of has this weird morphology. That's the San Andreas Fault that's kind of creating this slit down here. That's Tamales Bay that you can see in that slit. But so we're looking at these estuaries there, and they provide some really tremendous opportunities when you think about sea otter recovery, because again, what we know about them through the historic data, through the Native American middens, is that they were likely in these estuaries. Also, some of these estuaries, like Drake's Estero, are within a national park, and in fact, they're within a wilderness area. And so, part of the goal of the national park there in Point Reyes is to bring back the ecosystem to more of a natural state, which would include sea otters. So, having this kind of portfolio of options for recovery is going to be really important, whether you're thinking about California or Oregon, and not trying to put all your eggs in one basket. So we're looking at this from not only a habitat perspective like we did in San Francisco Bay, but we're looking at it also from a prey perspective. So do these estuaries have enough adequate prey to support a sea otter population? And so we have here on the left is a former student, Daniela Smith, who's part of her undergraduate thesis was looking at crab populations in the marsh. Here's yours truly pulling up a crab trap with a ton of crab in it, which is very typical of what we see in these estuaries in Point Reyes, is that when we compare it to even San Francisco Bay that has no otters, and then Morro Bay and Elkhorn Slough that does have otters, it really strongly indicates that there's a major significant potential prey source for sea otters within Point Reyes, and specifically the Drake's Estero. And so what you see here on the left is edible crab biomass. It's basically the calories that the otter would get minus like the shell, and because that doesn't really provide much caloric intake. So we're considering all of these different spots really to provide the managers with a broader portfolio. But we can also think about things that are going outside of Northern California. Outside of the Northern California estuaries has been this significant loss of kelp in pretty much the entire stretch of Northern California from Bodega Bay to Crescent City. And a lot of it's due to climate change, but a lot of it's also due to the loss of their other predator, the sea star, due to sea star wasting disease, and the proliferation of these urchins. So it kind of begs the question, if we restore sea otters or food webs through estuaries, this could also potentially provide some benefits outside the estuary to these kelp forests too, they're suffering greatly from overgrazing by urchins. So I'm going to just wrap this up with, I hope I've challenged you a little bit on what you actually think a sea otter really is. I really encourage you to think about the true niche of the sea otter. One thing I didn't really mention is, the potential negative impacts. What we saw, sea otters like to eat crab, right? And so If there's extensive crab fisheries and in the estuaries, that should also be considered. And we often, are when considering reintroduction or relocation or population increases, these conflicts can emerge. But I think the lesson learned from us has been it's better to engage all community partners early on in that process. So I really encourage you to do that. I would like to thank all these different collaborators. As you all know, like this kind of research and these efforts take a large team of managers, students, scientists, citizens, and they're all part of the team and all contributing. I'd like to thank these funding sources and entities that I'm associated with. Here, I'd like to finish with Sea Otter crossing the road in Elkhorn Slough. Right now, we have to actually put Sea Otter crosswalk signs to prevent people from killing the sea otter because they're trying to jump from marsh to marsh. So if you're ever in Elkhorn Slough, make sure you slow down for the sea otter on the road. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Brent. And there's a virtual applause happening behind the curtain of our Zoom protocols here. Thank you for that presentation. And we're going to try to fit in some Q&A. We'll try to do about 4 minutes of Q&A here before the next talk starts.
Okay.
So first question, which is a combination of a couple of people. You mentioned some of the species of crabs. Could you go in a little more detail about the common species of crabs found that sea otters were preying on in the estuaries, and kind of proportionally what proportion for each?
Yes. So and this is for Central California estuaries, but I think a lot of these species are going to apply to yours too. In our estuaries, it's Cancer antenarius. There's been some name changes too. I'm just going to use the old names if that's all right. Cancer antenarius, Cancer productus, red rock crabs. Those are the primary ones. But then this more secondary ones that we see are Dungeness. And like I said in the talk, Dungeness crab are they're not the big Dungeness that we like to eat and catch in the estuary. In our Central California estuaries, they're a lot smaller. They're like this big. So they're more like a secondary kind of crab species. And now, and then on top of that, Pugetia, which is the kelp crab. It's also an estuary seagrass crab. And we see them eating those, maybe not at as great of a rate, but I think there's been a recent paper coming out from Washington, state of Washington, identifying Pugetia as a major prey item for sea otters. And then these marsh crabs, Pachygraptus crassipes, the striped shore crab, has been what we've seen a really important prey item in the marshes. And now the European green crab, Carcinus manus, the invasive. So those are the primary crabs. I believe all those crabs are in your estuaries too. So that's, and there might be others like sheep crab or decorator crab, but they're a little more rare. But yeah.
Great, thank you. One question from Ed, and he's wondering if Brent's population models include prey availability. Is there enough food for 6,000 otters?
We haven't done, so for that San Francisco one, we only incorporated the habitats. We didn't do the prey component, which is kind of this new thing we're trying to do with Drake's Sparrow Point Reyes estuaries. It would be cool to go back and try to do that. 6,000, a lot of things have changed too. There's a lot of invasives in there. There's corbula clams, which are these little tiny clams, but there's like billions and billions of them. So the whole thing has kind of changed. And, I think there's definitely some need to figure out, San Francisco Bay would be a huge target, right? So I believe that would need to be looked at a little more in depth to see what the prey availability would be like, but also, how would the sea otters be impacting those prey?
Gotcha. I know Tim will maybe talk a little bit about this, but one question we have from Danielle is, do we know if great white and orca predation were challenges for sea otters historically, or is this a challenge that we know of?
Yeah, so this is, and I've thought about this too, and Tim probably has more thoughts. And if we put in that like evolutionary perspective of millions of years, yeah, they probably always kind of interacted. But sea otter expansion, over time took millions of years, and so I think those interactions have probably been going on for a very, very long time. It's just with the hunting to near extinction. It probably just presents a bigger challenge in our present world, of right now, currently, which we sit in. So I think we see it as a kind of a challenge for the recovery. But these interactions have probably been going on for millions of years.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And what we'll do, there's a few more questions that folks have for you. So maybe if you don't mind, after Tim's talk, we may try to circle back to some of these.
Okay.
If we have time there. I know Bob has
Sure.
picked the ball up here, and we'll start introducing the next speaker soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Brent.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
So I guess that means I'm on. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Brent. That was really great. I learn a lot every time I go through a presentation like this, and it just adds much more food for thought and ways to think about this task that we have set ourselves out on. So I appreciate it very much. So let's take a little 3 or 4 minute break here. We'll come back in about 5 minutes and we'll go with Dr. Tinker. So thank you, everybody. Let's take a quick